right, let's get started. So my name is Ann Tutwiler. I am delighted to be here, first of all, delighted to be invited. Of course, as all of us are delighted to be back here after a hiatus of a few years. And welcome to those of you who are hanging on and here for this last session of the last day. So my name is Ann Tutwiler. I am with Meridian Institute, but also in the capacity today, I'm a senior advisor to the Just Rural Transition, which was created in the aftermath of the 2019 Climate Week in New York to try to actually bring people into the center of the conversations we were having about how do we transform our agriculture sector. And I think that's largely what this panel is going to be about today. So let me just give you a brief overview of the background of this panel, and then I'll introduce our panelists and move straight into the questions that we are going to be asking them. So it's very important as we think about creating and building these pathways to achieve zero hunger and limit greenhouse gas emissions to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in my world, we call this the 1.5 plus scenario. So it's hunger, it's nutrition, it's environment, it's climate, and it's equity, very importantly. So for the solutions, this 1.5 plus solution to be just, it needs to address the needs of the most vulnerable in our societies and in our food and agricultural systems. And looking towards COP27, which is just now in a few short weeks, and beyond, these groups, these vulnerable groups need to be part of the solution and part of the conversation if justice and equity are going to be at the center of how we address and solve these issues. And if I can just offer a couple of short sort of personal comments on this issue. So, as I mentioned, Just Rural Transition is focused on food systems transformation, but with this important equity and inclusion component. And I think we need to think about this as not only the right thing to do, because it is the right thing to do, but we have to do it for very important reasons. We have seen time and time again in the Netherlands, in India, in many other places, when the needs of farmers, the needs of the people who are most affected are not taken into account, the reforms are not successful, and they create political problems. So just from a pure, how do we get this done, we need to take the concerns of the vulnerable and people who are usually excluded into account. The second point I wanted to make is that a lot of the conversations I'm involved in are with very important, very well-meaning, very good-hearted organizations, researchers, who tend to be from the global north. And it's great that we have so many people now coming into the sector, so many people involved, but I do not see enough faces around the table of people who are representing the vulnerable populations, farmers, people from developing countries. It's still, despite many years of preaching about this issue, we still just don't see enough engagement, in my view. And I think the other final point I wanted to leave you with before introducing the panel is that what I often hear in these circles is that, yes, we want to be inclusive, but it just takes too much effort. It's going to slow us down. And I just want to reiterate what I say to the people who make those arguments, is we are not going to be successful in the long run if we are not inclusive. And it is not a trade-off between inclusivity and getting things done quickly. If we aren't inclusive, we will never achieve our goals. So I think that's what this panel is about. So they allowed me to make a few editorial comments. So with that, let me introduce very briefly our speakers. So On video, we have Ana Maria Lobo-Guerrero, who is the Research Director of Climate Action at my old organization, the Alliance for Biodiversity International, and CIAT, which is a member of the CGIAR system. We have Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, who is the principal researcher at the International Water Management Institute of the CG, where I was on the board until quite recently. And Dr. Gavin Schmidt, who is the director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Welcome. And in the room here, we have Dr. Gabe Sibley, who is CEO and founder of Verdant Robotics, and you can tell that because he's got the Verdant Robotics hat on. Ms. Toni Stanger McLaughlin, who is CEO of the Native American Agriculture Fund. Welcome. We have Dr. Jo Sweenan, Managing Director of Systems Transformation at the CG IAR and Director of the International Food Policy Research Institute. And Ms. Sanna Strohschneider, who is Program Manager at Wageningen University's Food and Bio-Based Research. Didn't quite get the Wageningen. And finally, Mateusz Czasnocha.
Precisely.
Yeah? Oh, very good. Who is a regenerative farmer in Poland and a member of the European Carbon Farmers. So, welcome to you all. So my first job is, how we're going to run this session is, I have 3 or 4 questions I'm going to ask the speakers, the panelists. We're going to have 2 or 3 of them answering each of those questions, and then a little bit of an open discussion. And I have told them that I am going to stand up if they start going over their time, so they will know. And hopefully, you folks on video will be able to see me standing up as well. Okay. So question 1. And this is for Jo, Sanna, and Aditi. And Aditi, I'll come to you first on video, okay, on the virtual panel, okay? So rural and marginalized indigenous and diverse populations face the greatest consequences of climate adverse events. And we need to sustainably increase the resilience, and we've talked a lot about resilience in the last panels today, of the world's most vulnerable families to food system shocks, and ensure that they are able to afford and access enough nutritious food. How can we elevate their vital perspective and role in sustainable food systems? So, Aditi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you to the World Food Prize Foundation for this invitation. This just brings back so many pleasant memories. I was just chatting with Anna a while ago, saying that I stood there exactly 10 years ago, receiving that Borlaug Award for young researchers, and it's just so amazing to be back this time online, though. Thanks, Anne, for your question. I think that's a critical, very important question that you are asking, and I think my answer is that there are several ways that in which we can reach out to the most vulnerable population. And one of them is, I mean, some of these you have already mentioned, giving, allowing those kind of, making sure that those kind of diverse voices are heard, that those voices are not tokenized. Those are not like, we are not doing a kind of a checklist, kind of a, yeah, done, we have a, global South or indigenous person in our panel, and that's it. We have done what was our diversity thing, and then I think for us to do that, I think it's very important to understand that climate change is a matter of physics, and it's a matter of justice and fairness. As long as we don't kind of acknowledge that there is a deep climate injustice, those who are the most deeply impacted are the ones who have emitted the least. I think that should be at the heart of climate change. Given, like very briefly, I think this can be done. It's like in the scientific community where I come from, and I was involved in this IPCC AR6 assessment. I was one of the coordinating lead authors for the water chapter, and what I saw IPCC do very well was they actually took on board this criticism that their AR5 was all male, all white kind of a author group, and they actually took diversity very, very seriously, with the result that AR6 became a very diverse group of authors, and you know how effective those reports have been. So I think it's just not, it should not be just words and tokenization, but you have to go beyond and do those actions. Those actions won't be easy, but completely worth doing. And for me, the IPCC AR6 cycle is a very good example of how diversity actually leads to a better product in this case, and for that, it would be better outcome. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Perfect, 23 seconds left to go. Thank you. All right, if I can turn to Yo.
Okay, I'm now looking at your watch.
Starting it again.
So I think, well, the answer is obviously a whole package of things. Let me just emphasize a few, and I'm sure things will come out during the discussion and the complementary. I think on the social side, clearly in the crisis situation now, we need really significant humanitarian aid that needs to be spent in several of the countries most suffering from the high food prices and the lack of access to food. Social protection programs are really important. I think it's a bit more of a long-term solution, but a very important long-term solution. And I think in both of them, we should make sure we're not just looking at the quantity of food, but also at the nutritional quality, the diet quality. Gender issues are particularly important, I think. We know that gender and gender bias is there in terms of how people are affected by the crisis and by the structural shortcoming in general. So we have to address this explicitly in our program throughout the food chain, I think. Then in terms of access to technologies, I think it's really important. That means investing in technologies, public investment in technologies which the market may not deliver, which is really particularly targeted to the poorest. And of course, we have to make sure that the poorest, once the technologies are on the market, can actually access them. So we have to look at credit programs, insurance programs, etc. And so this brings me to the last point I wanted to make, and this is about finance. And so if we want to make this work, we just need to have more finance going in, okay? And that means we don't necessarily, doesn't have to come from the same traditional sources that we have. I think we need, broadly speaking, what in the Food Systems Summit we call the new food finance architecture. And there's a number of components to it. Part of it is private. Consumer spending is a big source of finance, potentially, if we can direct this. Investments by company in the value chains. Going to the capital markets, which we traditionally have not been very good at sourcing, I think. There's a lot of work for innovative work. And on the public sector side, I think there's both domestic investments and international transfers, aid and World Bank loans, for example. But I think the whole issue of repurposing existing agricultural support, the $700 billion out there, which is spent, and a lot of it is not very effective in what we try to do. So rethinking this, the way these $700 billion are spent, I think is a really important strategy going forward.
Great. Thank you. 37 seconds. You can bank that for the next time. So, Sana.
I can take his time?
Yeah, sure, go ahead. Sana.
Yeah, just to add to that, and first of all, thank you for being on this quite impressive panel. It's an honor to be here. I think to respond to your question, it's really important that we realize that many of the efforts that we are undertaking to increase sustainability and resilience are actually aimed at sectors that are highly informal, especially in low and middle income countries. And that means that they operate outside of the legal and the regulatory systems, and they also do not respond that well to most of the plans and the measures and the incentives that we have organized. And this missing middle, basically, is an interesting key, I think, to what we want to accomplish. They are very deeply rooted, very often, in their socio-economic and political context. They tend to be more resilient, more flexible. And in addition to economic motives, they're also very often driven by other motives, such as kinship or faith. And I think that really gives them a key role in promoting some of these goals that we are here discussing. And I think it's also a blind spot, and I think fruits and vegetables are a very good example of this. In lower middle income countries, the supply chains in these produces are dominated by informal entrepreneurs. And they are very effective at doing this, not very efficient. significant quantities of food is being lost or wasted. And very often the solutions that we offer, such as processing of surplus or cold storage, they do not resonate because they are very often not economically feasible for these informal economies. But these midstream operators, they are able to translate the needs of marginalized consumers, and they are able to innovate in products and in delivery modes. And I think that doesn't always require huge investments in infrastructure or in logistics, but they do offer better integration economically for women and youth very often in relation to the very long supply chains. So these small and informal businesses, they play a key role. And I think in order to elevate their perspective and role in more sustainable food systems, we really need to acknowledge the role that they can play and approach them, but also support them with dedicated incentives and measures, which will require of the more formal institutions to really cross the line into informality.
Great.
And that might be a bit uncomfortable, but I think there's a big key factor to success there.
Perfect, thank you. So we now have a little time for an open discussion and comments from some of the other panelists. And I know, Gavin, I think you wanted to come in on this point.
Sure. I mean, my role as a climate modeler and a producer of the projections that we are afraid of and the impacts that are going to relate from that means that I listen to these discussions, and I'm not somebody who is engaged in talking to people around the world at the small scale on issues of climate resilience, but we are talking about the 1.5 target and the changes that we're going to see as we get closer to that. It's kind of key, I think, that we all remember a few kind of basic climate science things. And the first thing is that temperatures are only going to stabilize at whatever level once we get to effectively net zero carbon dioxide emissions. So whether that happens at 1.5 degrees, 1.8 degrees, 2 degrees or higher depends on how quickly we reduce emissions to that net zero value. We're not currently on a track to reduce them fast enough to stay at 1.5. That's an unfortunate consequence of how slow the larger emitters are at reducing their emissions. But maintaining the impetus and momentum towards 1.5 is a mitigation problem, right? It's the emissions problem. But then dealing with the climate changes that we have already seen, right? We're already seeing the impacts of the more than 1 degree warming that we've seen since the pre-industrial. We're already seeing those impacts in heat waves, in intense rainfall, in sea level rise. Those issues and the adaptation that we need to build to those changes, the resilience that we need to build to those changes, those are as important questions, but they're not the same questions. And so, a lot of the discussion here has been about adaptation and resilience, and that's a great focus. But the momentum towards 1.5 or keeping it as low as possible is a mitigation issue, and there, these poor farmers, the people that we're talking about here, they're not responsible for that. Right? It's not they're not the big emitters. The US, China, India, and the high emitting countries are the big emitters, and those are the ones that we need to target. And maybe this isn't quite the right forum to push on that, but all paths to 1.5 or anywhere close to it require faster and further action by those high emitters, not by changes to how we deal with small-scale food production.
Yeah. I think that's very much bringing this idea that there's a bigger equity question here, right? It's not just about bringing people who are in marginalized communities into this conversation, but also where responsibilities lie for moving faster on addressing the 1.5 challenge. Anna, do you want to talk about some of the initiatives that Biodiversity and CIAT have in terms of engaging with marginalized communities? I know that's something we were quite involved with, yeah.
Yeah, so we have been doing a lot of work in terms of co-generating and co-testing and co-evaluating these kind of solutions. And we had something that that worked for several years through something that we call climate smart villages. And it was really, really interesting because it was doing research in relation to these type of innovations in a participatory way with the communities. And something that perhaps I would like to highlight about that work was that we learned very fast the importance of really being able to empower these communities through capacity building and through different ways to give them voice. And in these communities that we were working, they were the leaders. Basically, from the research side, we were just the facilitators and providing perhaps knowledge in relation to some needs that the community expressed to us. And it was really interesting how they became the scientists in these communities. Mm-hmm. They really understood what they were doing. I remember that one time this was in Colombia, we brought the board of SIA to see one of these climate smart villages, and the leader of the community, she was so energetic and totally convinced about that. The way that she was talking about the importance of the activities that they were implementing in terms of compost, in terms of how that was contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and how through their work in that community specifically, they were working really hard to address the issue of climate change. And it was impressive, and it came because of having these people empowered, being able to understand what were the big challenges and how, through the work that they were doing, they would respond to those. So for us, it was really interesting, and how there was this communication in terms of, because these people were the ones that were going every day into their fields and then experiencing what was happening with a change in temperature, with a change in precipitation. They had all this information, and then again, we facilitate the importance of, or emphasize the importance of collecting that information, but they were the ones that were collecting the information. And since they were the ones leading the process, that's why they were implementing these actions. They were prioritizing them and deciding what was best for the community. And the outcome was really interesting in terms of building this resilience. Let me stop there, Anne.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to come in, commenting on what they've heard or talking about what their organization is doing? Yeah, Mateus.
Looking at the time, one very brief point, but I think critical. We've been exposed to tremendous systemic perspectives on what needs to be done, and especially the point about informality of the reality in many of the countries is tremendous. I love it. But one point I would like to bring is, let's not forget about the human and human connection. Like, the environmental crisis really is a social crisis. And we have over 7 billion faces that are faces of climate crisis. Like, we are all affected. And for me, like, bringing in the systemic perspective and thinking and then implementing and scaling up, because we are in the decade of action, those systemic solutions is critically important, but equally important, if not more, is having this one-on-one connection, because I've asked farmers back home in Poland before coming here, like, hey, I'm on this panel, and I translated the title of the panel to them, and they've been completely lost. They didn't know what I will be talking about. And I've asked them for, hey, what would you like me to say on your behalf in this panel? So education and especially having scientists explaining in a way that is empowering in those conversations, in those engagements, is critically important.
I think one thing that here in the United States recently, last month, the president had a convening on food, nutrition, and hunger. And it was the first time in the United States in over 50 years that we'd had such a convening. And during that convening, $8 billion was pledged towards ending hunger in 2030. And connected to that was $2.5 billion that would be associated to new innovation, to industry, technology, and marrying that with the additional funding that would go towards philanthropy and leveraging other federal funds. One of the things that we need to connect, and you took my talking point, that in order to reevaluate global food insecurity and environmental sustainability, including reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we have to reevaluate how we face those challenges, and in particular, how we find the solutions through transformative investments, and tying those back to the producers themselves, making sure that regulation, our industry, and here in the United States, that our representatives don't get ahead of what will work for our producers, what they can buy into, what they've already been doing, and how quickly they can transition.
Perfect. That's a great segue into the next question. So, and Tony, you're on tap to address the next question, so perfect. So if we want to focus on policies, programs, and systemic strategies as key pathways to achieving, let's just call it the 1.5 degree plus that I mentioned earlier, what are the key policies that we need to address these environmental and, Matthias, as you said, social consequences and social components of a just transition? And concretely, what kinds of programs and initiatives can help countries and enterprises, and it doesn't say farmers here, but and farmers and the, I think, as you so rightly pointed out, the sort of missing middle to achieve and facilitate this just transition. So I'm going to give the floor to Tony and then to Gavin, but I would love to have Yo coming in on this question of repurposing subsidies. So, Tony.
I think that when we're talking, this panel's about hunger as well, about nutrition. And when you mention the middle, there's a middle in hunger. And we talk about food insecurity, but there's a level of food insecurity and malnutrition of those that are actively working in the United States. It would be those that don't qualify for federal assistance. Those needs need to tap into that level of need as well. So 1 in 4 Native Americans in a survey that we recently did during COVID, they stated that they were food insecure. And that study also said, where did you go for help? And we find again and again throughout the world that the first place you go to is the place you trust, whether that is your local municipality, in our instance, our tribal governments. One of the last layers are those state entities, it would be, provinces, or your region, are here in the United States to the federal government assistance. We also see that people will go to their food banks, to their churches. So including those entities in the solution, but also here and abroad, thinking about the solutions as an investment as opposed to a handout. And that gets very political in the United States between a hand up and a handout. And if we meet that middle line and find technology solutions from the ground up that will impact everybody in this space, both in the food hunger space and also in the environmental space, then those solutions will stick. We also know that money talks, and so making sure that it's incentivized, but it goes back because since time immemorial across the world, indigenous communities in particular have been caring for and stewards of the land. Here, protecting in the United States, our indigenous communities aren't part of the solution, largely are left out of finding the solution. And we need to be at the forefront of that. And some of our solutions and practices that have continued to exist also should be part of, where appropriate, monetization and recognition, and their knowledge should be protected as we find the solution together.
Great. Gavin, if I can turn to you.
Yeah. Let me give you a quick perspective. I think I'm the only member of the federal government here, so maybe I shouldn't really speak for the whole federal government. But what we've seen, in the last couple of years is a much greater willingness to have joined up thinking about all of these challenges, to look for solutions that are climate smart, that improve resilience, that also support climate and environmental justice efforts. And my interactions within my agency and across the other agencies in DC has been that there's been a tremendous kind of outpouring of willingness to do a better job on these kinds of issues. Nonetheless, there are still a lot of left hands doing things that the right hands are not aware of, and there are a lot of embedded structures within the US system that incentivize the wrong kind of behavior, or that incentivize solutions. When I say wrong kind of behavior, what I mean is incentivize solutions that are not win-win for both the environment and for justice and for equity. And it's taking a while to kind of move these things around, and some of them are very strongly embedded. Indeed. One of the things that we can do, so I work for NASA, right? So we're not a policy agency, but we are one of the preeminent groups that, as was mentioned earlier, that people trust, right? So data from NASA is trustworthy data. People have a lot of confidence in what we bring to the table. And I think that it's very important that we allow more people to sit at that table so that they can I don't know, maybe drink not quite from the fire hose of data that we produce, but sip at appropriate levels. And we do produce a lot, and we have to work harder to tailor the information that we produce, the solutions, the impacts that we predict. We have to make sure that is available to a wider range of people, not just other scientists, but local governments, tribal governments, small enterprises, small farmers, so that they know what's coming and what they need to be preparing for. And we will be doing a better job there, but we have still quite a long ways to go.
Great, thank you. Yo, I want to come to you to talk about, since we worked together on the repurposing agriculture subsidy agenda, if you could talk a little bit about that and the thinking of how do we take this $700 billion that governments are spending and use it to help us down this 1.5 plus pathway. And then, Gabe, I'm going to ask you about how programs could help with the kinds of technologies that your company is developing next. So.
Okay, thanks, Anne. And in a way, we should invite you to say something on that. Because you are, and obviously have done a lot of work on this. I think the idea is basic that, okay, if we're looking for new sources of funding for this, let's maybe also look at whether the funding that is already there, whether you can use that better. That's really the essence of the repurposing story. So it is giving it a different purpose, but in a very broad sense, I think. And so part of it could be money which is currently, and we know there's a lot of analysis on this now, that this, not all, there's quite a variety in terms of this 700 billion. Some of it is going to fertilizer subsidies, for example, in Africa. Some of it is going to farm subsidies in many rich countries in the world and in China, etc. And the conditions of these subsidies varies quite a bit. Some are very trade and market distorting, some are less. But the idea is still that overall, clearly, they are not delivering in terms of the environmental objective that we set, and not even in terms of the social objective that we set. And so we can do better. And so we should think about using some of these many billions of dollars in terms of investment in public goods. And public goods can mean a lot of things. They can be infrastructure investments to make sure that remote areas are included in the world, okay? And we know that remoteness is a really important indicator of poverty, of low productivity, etc. It can also be investments in technology and R&D. And so when you mention R&D, people think, well, that's going to be 20, 30 years before we have a result. But there's a lot of technologies available right now which are not being used. And people are not using them because the incentives are not there, or they are constrained in basically taking them on board. And this can be because the credit markets do not work, the insurance market do not work, or a variety of things. So making these subsidies, changing that in terms of lowering the barriers, increasing the capacities, but also in terms of changing incentives, okay? Incentives are extremely important throughout the food chain, from the consumer all the way down to the production side. And I think I've had some really interesting discussions over the past 2 days in terms of, for example, the fertilizer subsidy issue we discussed. There's quite a bit which can be done on that as well, I think, for making them more effective use of fertilizer. Also, I mean, in a variety of ways, I think making them more sustainable in the long run and things. And of course, when you look at the richer OECD countries, most of it is on ag support, agriculture, farm support, and there we can use it differently, I think, to make them more consistent with an environmental agenda.
Gabe, I think that's a great opening for you in terms of how our current subsidies limiting the adoption of technologies that could deliver more sustainability. Yeah.
I mean, I really think the key is ingenuity and innovation. It is technology that gets us through, but not just more efficient and productive ways to grow, how we can increase yields by using less, but also business model innovations. How can we make sure that, you know, the gross margins of a company are the same in North America as in India? And that comes through really technology that is being commoditized. We can all get high-speed internet from space today, and we all walk around with supercomputers in our pocket. And that's the human population that has that capability, not just folks in North America. So machine learning, robotics, computer vision, all of the technologies that are absolutely transforming pretty much every industry are going to transform agriculture. We can grow more with less. Our business uses those technologies to park millimeter accurate inputs from the time the seeds grow into the ground to the time they come out. We use less to grow more. And the business model, because we partner with local folks and the hardware is cheap and the software is sophisticated, it works on farms of all sizes in any place in the world. And so that doesn't necessarily need, you know, top-down stimulation for it to happen. What it needs is innovation around entrepreneurs going out and getting that work done. Now, there could be public-private partnerships that make that happen faster, and we do need to move very quickly. Because ultimately, when you're using 95% less fertilizer, you're producing 95% less fertilizer. It's a massive impact on greenhouse. And it's better for the grower, for their pocketbook. It's better for the consumer in terms of the health of the food that they use. It's better for sustaining soil. So yes, the technologist will tell you that the solution is technology.
Anybody else want to come in on this issue of policies and programs and systemic strategies to help us get there? Yes, I was going to turn to you if you didn't raise your hand.
Thank you. 2 points. One, we need to be radical from my perspective. Like, we need drastical changes now. And an example would be a change of the common agricultural policy away from action-based payments, in which we are in right now, to result-based payments, for which I am advocating to my government and to the European Commission. But then back to the first point I've been making about social component of the changes and reality that we are in, which should be our starting point. We cannot be radical, right? So we need to have radical goals, but then the implementation has to be as fast as possible, but socially not even acceptable, but like driven by the society with seeing individual faces in that, right? That's why the approach, once again, I would be using the approach of the European Union, which is the policy that binds me as a farmer. That's why the European Commission is proposing a hybrid approach to carbon farming scheme that member states are encouraged to apply in the Common Agricultural Policy for 2023-2027. Some of which did that, many others didn't. So how do we encourage within the member states to use the best practices that we already know should be rolled out, rather than basically say, oh, we still need, I don't know how many years of research or this other consultation to delay the process.
I'd like to add something.
Yeah. Tony.
We actually have a roadmap for this here in the United States. It's embedding a lot of what's been said on the panel. And that is a report on our website, the Native American Agriculture Fund, and it's reimagining native food economies, where we talk about centralizing agricultural infrastructure into rural communities, which will reduce transportation costs, cold storage costs, embedding technology into those hubs and sub-hubs, providing and unburdening individual producers and our tribal governments and other municipalities, because these hubs have been envisioned so that they will support everyone in that rural economy. We all experienced issues during the pandemic and supply chain issues, so reducing that burden as well. But that proposal, it includes also standing up other facets of agriculture and combining all sorts of funding to make that happen. There are a few examples in the United States currently, and it's somewhat of a cooperative structure, but it's also an investment structure, because if you're investing technology into that hub or sub-hub, you will derive money back from that. You will benefit in a profit. And similarly, those producers that maybe might not have enough, whatever they're growing, whether it's cattle or not, to be a producer and sell and be viable themselves, with other members of their community they could be. And so figuring out where that can be mimicked internationally would be wonderful. We're pursuing that right now in the United States.
Sounds like that's something we should share. Yes, Aditi.
I wanted to come back on that on that example of repurposing subsidies. I think that's an incredibly important point that Joe and you mentioned. I was recently doing some field work in Bangladesh where we have a project on solar irrigation. And so what the government is trying to do is connect these off-grid solar pumps to the grid, so that these pumps kind of work for only 100 days in a year while they remain idle for the rest of the year. So it's actually a great idea that you connect them to the grid and you increase the renewable mix in the grid. And then they were offering a certain buyback price tariff to buy it back from the farmers, and those tariff was like kind of quite low. And then we figured out that the government actually buys electricity from diesel pumps, from like diesel, not pumps, but diesel based generation, power generation plants at much like 2 or 3 times higher that price. And then it kind of completely boggles your mind that why would they not pay more for buying renewable energy, because by not doing so, and we have to remember that farmers at the end of the day are paying most of the cost of that energy. I mean, so that's, I think these are the kind of examples that that are just all around us, that there's no reason why we can't repurpose some of these subsidies to ensure that our aim is that 1.5 degree. So coming to that 1.5 degree is also important, that unless we can limit ourselves to 1.5 degree, many of the adaptation things that we are talking about here will also become ineffective. That's what the latest report is showing. Yeah. I'll stop there. Sorry, I made you stand.
That's okay. That's okay. All right. Thank you very much. But that really illustrates the importance of shining a light, on these practices when farmers think this is just what the government's paying. And then you can say, no, 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 but they're paying the people who are generating electricity with diesel a lot more, and it gives power to change the dynamics of that deal. So it was a great example. Thank you very much. So let me transition to the third question, and this is for Anna Marie and Gabe and Mateus. So how do we ensure that these actions that we're talking about are actually rooted in science and evidence and knowledge, and not just philosophy, if I can put it that way, and that they're both achievable, just, and scalable? And I think the scalable issue is something we were talking about just before we came in, Gabe. And what will it take, importantly, to build coalitions that include all of the voices that we need to have around the table that are beyond the sort of traditional stakeholders that we normally talk about in the food and agribusiness sector? So Anne-Marie, if I can turn to you first.
Yes, Anne, thank you for the question. So let me just emphasize 5 principles that I believe that are relevant in order to achieve those actions with the characteristics that you just mentioned. And this is very much from a research perspective on how we can do research in a way that we can achieve those kind of activities. The first principle, we really need to have a big picture, action-oriented thinking. And this implies having a shared ambition to solve these challenges that we are discussing. And there was a lot of discussion in terms of technologies. We need to go beyond just developing a technology or piloting an intervention. And I'm saying this because these type of challenges are not organized in typical academic disciplines. So we need for both academic and research institutions that we can ensure that we advance in terms of disciplinary knowledge, but we need to make sure that we have the right incentives and the right environment to integrate transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. So very, very important that we include social scientists in terms of understanding these technologies, people that do research in terms of human behavior. So I think that can help us to get closer to those actions. The second principle, we need more of an entrepreneurial organization culture. And with this, I mean, we need to be able to have a safe space to think about new ideas, implement nimble budgets and staffing, focus on rapid learning, and very important, being able to move without fear of failure. And also this implies, going back to the first principle, breaking these disciplinary silos. The third principle is in relation to context and paying close attention to partnerships. Very important. This means listening to stakeholders, undertaking purposeful design with clients, with beneficiaries, and really important, understanding that every scaling context and geography is different and adjusting to those differences. And we need to be able to support experimentation, trying and adapting to new settings. The fourth principle is the need to have a diverse investment portfolio with different levels of risks of the actions that we are implementing. So this means having a portfolio of work that combines higher risk, higher payoff options, but at the same time that we have more reliable but incremental outputs. And this needs to be done in a parallel way in terms of targeting a diverse set of co-investors that can accept risk-taking. And then, sorry, I was taking. And then the last one, but this is super important, is being mindful about using a social equity framework. And this is very related about, you talk, Anne, about transformation. We need transformative adaptation in this agenda. And with transformative adaptation, I mean, we need to really address the root causes rather than the symptoms, of vulnerability. And this is very important because this can help us to build this resilience in agricultural systems. But the key challenge is that traditionally, we are not having a focus on social equity. And the problem of this is that under some circumstances, these adaptation actions can reinforce inequities. So these.
I'll come back to you.
Finish by. Okay.
You'll have another chance. Don't worry. So, okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
But no, I mean, great answers in terms of, you know, as my husband says to me, go big or go home, right? Let's not think small, and be willing to take risks. And I think, you know, and certainly the multidisciplinary, which I think the CG is actually getting there on the multidisciplinary focus. So, but being able to take risks and be able to fail, I think is, as you say, really, really important. Gabe.
I think a big place where, you know, government can help. First and foremost, you know, on planet Earth, there's no such thing as an externality. There are just prices that somebody else pays some other time, some other place. So the more we can price in those costs, then we are forced to use solutions that are innovative to deal with them. And those productivity gains and efficiency gains, that is value creation. And so if that technical solution can then be made broadly accessible through business models that work anywhere, then you get water flowing downhill. You know, your average farmer is very happy if he can save money on a weeding bill. And if you can do that in a way that's cost-effective, sustainable, uses less and does more, you win, and you can really sell that anywhere. But that's really recognizing that innovation can help and also help make it accessible to anybody. So got to price in the externalities. That's unavoidable. Otherwise, we're just going to pay it some other time, as we are now. And if that is priced in, then there will be technical solutions, and they will affect everybody.
Yeah, and I think one of the important issues, you know, there's a lot of conversations now about, you know, true value of food, true cost accounting, and there's somehow always an assumption, well, that the consumer is going to pay those prices, which is does not necessarily have to be the case. I mean, it can be distributed along the value chain, it could be ultimate consumer, but it also could be that the government, through this repurposing of subsidies, is paying to offset some of those negative externalities that we see coming from the food and ag sector. So, so I took a couple of your minutes. So, yeah, great. Okay, Matthias.
I like your last point, Anne, like really insightful to kind of think outside the box. I'm taking that home in my conversations with the government and other actors. To answer the first part of your question, how do we ensure the transition is all of that we would like it to be, and building on what Anna beautifully said, the framework. I think two major points for me to add there are we need to provide spaces and opportunities for people like me, farmers who are new to that space, or any other group to raise a hand and say, hey, like, I don't know what you are talking about. Like, I need an explanation. And I think big reason for why we see, and I also saw, a lot of failures is this, like people being lost and not having the opportunity to basically do a very simple action of saying, I'm lost, can you bring me up to speed? Can I therefore buy in? So that is critically important. And then second thing, in achieving this transition with all those with all those qualities that we would like to see, is recognizing that we are talking about pathways. We are not talking about a pathway and nobody has the pathway, and we are not implementing the pathway even if we have the perfect science and like everything. No, it's a process, and we are all invited to live that process, I think, which is important to recognize. And then on the coalitions point, like once again, very basic things. What's the goal? We talked here at this conference about moonshot ambitions. You talked about that just now. We need clear goal and we need to aim high. Then, okay, what are the resources we are putting into place to deliver on that? And then I think third very critical point of getting coalitions off successfully is ability to stay committed, that I've been referring to before. And I will give two examples. One is CASH, Coalition of Action for Soil Health, emerging out of the UN Food System Summit that Dr. Latan Lal is one of the key people before, Dr. Behind that, which would be a coalition that I think about and I support strongly when it comes to an example of coalitions already happening. And another one that I am very proud of to be a board member of is EU Mission for Soil Health, so the European Union effort to have this holistic policy making, and to end with a simple call to action once again. One specific action I would like to see within, I guess, any government, but mine in particular, is my Minister of Agriculture having a one-on-one, uninterrupted conversation with Minister of Climate to talk about those topics, because we want to have systemic policy making, but we have a problem with doing the simplest things that are critical for achieving that. And I stop here.
I have such a nice little ring there, so great. No, I mean, this whole of government approach, which the U.S. government used when we were working on the Feed the Future program, and as many governments are moving towards that, where you actually have the Minister of Environment and Agriculture and Nutrition, et cetera, sitting down together and working through these issues, I think is a really, really important point, because otherwise they're all on different trajectories, on different language even, about what they want to, how they express themselves, how they talk about the challenges. So, Sana, do you want to talk about how to engage this informal sector and this missing middle that you talked about, or anything else that's on your mind?
What really triggers me in this discussion is that I really agree with Matthäus that it's a process, it's an iterative process, I think even. But I think from the perspective of researchers, I would like to add that we have to be quite clear on the scope. And it will also benefit, I think, if we are clear about the different meanings of a just transition. Because as far as I know, there is no scientific consensus, at least on a definition of this. And that means that we sometimes talk about hearing different voices or getting everybody at the table, or are we compensating for harm done? Is that now or in the past, or even maybe for future generations? Or are we talking about how benefits and costs are shared? And even the word just is a normative, bringing a normative purpose to transition, which sometimes even makes it political. So I think in that sense, it's really important that we set this scope and we include marginalized groups, but also all the other stakeholders, to basically settle themselves into the different perspectives of this discussion in order to make that integrated interdepartmental policy or decision making. And sometimes we skip over that part, but I think it would set us all at least at the same table at the same time. Yeah.
I would just say that the Just Real Transition actually presented a very early draft of what do we mean by these words. Right. But certainly, as you say, just is a very normative concept. We have countries who believe in it but won't sign on because of the political meanings of those words. So what you've said is very, very important. Aditi, I think you had wanted to come in on this particular question.
Yeah. I think I just also wanted to get back to this entire question of what the name of the topic of our conversation today is, 1.5 degrees, and the absolute importance of trying and sticking within that 1.5 degree. So the point I was trying to make earlier when I ran out of time was, so 1.5 degree is not only, it's a mitigation target, obviously, but the point is that our research is showing that if we exceed 1.5 or 2, many of the adaptation that we are talking about just simply do not remain effective anymore in reducing climate risk. So all the investments that we are doing now just kind of doesn't really work if the world gets that kind of warmer. So I would think in many ways adaptation is super important, but given how urgent the climate crisis is, perhaps for this decade, I mean, mitigation is kind of the new adaptation. Without mitigation, you can't really go ahead and adapt. And on the just transition, I think while the definitions kind of vary, I think at the heart of it, it really is that those who have emitted the least are the most impacted, for which the science is unequivocal. We do know that's happening. So how do you kind of help those to kind of, move into a new kind of a system with where emissions are less? I mean, we know that many of these places also have development deficits, right? So you need to overcome those development deficits. Farming, for instance, is one of the most, one of those really exposed sectors. And how do you do that without emitting more CO2 or greenhouse gases? And what kind of support you get for that, I think, is at the heart of just transitions. Though in the literature, it has often been used in the context of coal mines and how the coal workers get rehabilitated and trained to new occupation. But I think conceptually, we all kind of agree that the word just is really about who are historically responsible for emissions and who are getting the most impacted, and how do you bridge the gap between the two? I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yep, yo.
Have time? Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
I have 3.5 minutes. So.
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of the points that have come to the table are also about the trade-offs that exist, okay? So trade-offs between objectives that you want to reach, but also trade-offs in who is affected, who is benefiting, and the cost. And so this is one element in this problem. It's intergenerational, so it's a time issue, but there's also clearly a major geographic issue, both within countries and across borders. And then the issue is, normally how you deal with that is you set up compensation schemes, right, for the losers in order to make the investments in the winning. But that's obviously problematic if you have a global scale where the decisions are made domestically and the spillovers or the trade-offs are across borders. And so the issue of creating mechanisms of dealing with that. And when we talk about the issue of just here, okay, we talk here about, we've talked about the ethical component of what just is as well, but it's really about, there's an important political component on that, is that I remember I was working for the European Commission actually in 2000, and we designed a system to reform the subsidies in Europe. And so the first thing so we presented the scheme and said this is going to be great for Europe, much more efficient, etc. The first thing that people in the audience, which was policymakers, said, well, how is it affecting my farmers? Okay, and so the question is, if you don't explicitly take into account these distributional issues and whether you think it's just or not, clearly it's going to affect the decision-making process because the people who have to make the decisions are caring about it. And so bringing it out explicitly and trying to set up schemes of dealing with it is crucial, I think.
I think you raise an important issue too, is that there's a just set of processes to make sure voices are heard and engaged in these conversations, and then there's the element of is the outcome of whatever decision going to be just. And you need both of those, but even just starting with the processes is a big step forward, I think, in our world. So we have one more minute on this particular point. Yes. Gabe, yeah. Sorry, Gavin. Sorry, got my G's confused.
Yes, yes. Sorry, I just wanted to stress that last point. While science tells us what is happening and what the consequences of various causes of action are going to be or might be, but us deciding what to do about it is a value-based decision. Like, we can't run away from that. There isn't a universal set of values that everybody on Earth agrees on. So we have to be explicit about the values that we are highlighting and that we are pushing towards. And that inevitably becomes political, because there are going to be winners and losers and jostling for advantage and for justice. I mean, all of those things are political, and we can't avoid that. And so while scientists and other folks like myself often say, oh no, we just need to follow the science and we don't need to get involved in politics, I find that is that's very short-sighted. These are political issues. These are value-based judgments, and we need to be clear on what the values are that we are championing and make it abundantly clear that they are widely shared, perhaps not universally, but they are widely shared. And that is the way that we can build coalitions and constituencies for making things better.
Perfect, thank you. So we're going to turn to the last part of this, and those of you on our in our virtual world did not hear me say this, but when I ask you for a call to action, I'm going to ask you for one call to action, not a list of 5. So I'm going to start to my left.
Yeah, so I said it a couple of times already, and I'll say it again. I actually think that the leadership needs to come from the commercial transaction that you effectively have with a grower or a car buyer. The green path needs to be the path that is the EV. The leadership that Tesla has shown, and that is the path forward. The more productive path to grow needs to be the green path to grow. People will follow the money. If we focus on that, we can align the markets to achieve these goals. And so I think it's really critical that innovation is driven in that direction. So I think that that's the path forward.
Perfect. Tony.
That's similar to the plan that we have in our vision document, and furthermore, regionalizing infrastructure that will impact agriculture through the lens of green. That regional infrastructure and inviting in the United States is rural America to be at the table. Will make sure, so I say when rural America is healthy, all of America is healthy, and we can look at that internationally too. And when our rural economies are thriving, even if they're thriving in a micro-ism within the region that they exist. In Alaska, for instance, there's Alaska Native villages that are so tiny, but if only 2 people are gainfully employed in that small village, it will have an impact within that region.
Thanks. Yo.
Let's think about the new food finance agriculture, or not agriculture, food finance architecture, because that will help to address the social issues in terms of, for example, social protection programs, aid, and it will help hopefully to repurpose the existing support that is out there and to go after new innovative financing models which will help to invest in the future.
Sana.
Yeah, I can be really short. It's definitely my field of expertise, but also very fitting in this whole challenge. I have one major topic that I would like to bring in. That's really that we have to stop wasting our food resources. And that has become much more relevant even with the current energy crisis that we are facing. And this is creating a lot of tension between how we use our limited biomass. And I think that's really key to the many transitions that we have, because we're also decarbonizing, we're also going for more bio-based materials, but we have to really maintain those food resources to be nutritious. So that's my pointer.
Great.
Mine is, if you are not a farmer, visit a farmer. Like literally now put an appointment in your calendar, maybe not to visit a farmer because maybe you don't know. I mean, this audience probably knows farmers, but like put an appointment to figure out like which farmer can I meet, and like literally like act on it. And if you are a farmer, you are a carbon farmer. If there's one thing I want farmers to remember, like you are a carbon farmer no matter where you are in the world, no matter what people tell you, and then follow that insight. What are your carbon stocks that you steward over? What are your emissions profile? And what is that telling you?
Right. Thank you. Anna.
Yeah, thank you. And so my call to action is say, think beyond technologies. We need to consider these bundles of social, ecological, and technological dimensions and understand how they interact. We need to empower the most vulnerable people so that they can build their resilience. And we need to have capacity building partnerships and understanding of context at the core of our interventions.
Right. Aditi.
Hi, my call to action is for all of us who are involved in climate change in one way or the other to do all we can to keep within that 1.5 degree, because even 1.5 degree is just too warm for some parts. I used to work in the Himalayas, and we know that even 1.5 degrees is too warm in the small islands. So do all we can in whatever we do, research, advocacy, to make sure that we are able to be within that goal, which seems, well, very difficult, but yeah.
And Gavin, last word.
Oh, thank you. Information. The markets need information, decision makers need information, farmers need information. We need to be able to have information at people's fingertips right there and when they need it, without having to go through 20 different websites or different aggregators or like kind of know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. Information has to be at the fingertips of everybody who's making a carbon or food related decision. And we're not there yet, and we need to be.
Great, thank you. So we have 2 minutes to summarize. Anybody else want to add anything before we, yeah?
They all mentioned more numbers. You said one.
So if you want another one, I'll give you another one. So I think we've talked about a lot of different issues around, what does justice mean? Are we talking about just process, a just outcome? The issues around the intergenerational nature of the challenges that we face, the geographic dispersion of the challenges we face, and how do we achieve just processes and just outcomes across time and across space. And another big issue, which of course, as Joe mentioned, I work quite a lot on, is how do we use the resources that governments are already spending and that taxpayers are already paying for to help incentivize this 1.5 degree pathway. And then I think the last point I would make, and it's to echo Aditi's point, is that 1.5 is already too much for a lot of places in the world. And we saw some very scary maps if you were here for the ag map presentation yesterday morning. We saw some very scary maps about what the future looks like, even in this country, even in this state, about what the future might hold. So 1.5 is already too much. We've been focusing on adaptation a lot in our world, but we really need to put much more attention on the issues around climate mitigation if we're even to have a hope of addressing these 1.5 pathways. So with that, I will conclude. I think we have some important people coming to close us out for the final part of the World Food Prize. So let me thank the panelists and thank the audience for your great attention. And yeah, thank you very much.